Well, welcome everybody to today's 12th and final webinar for 2023 in our Realising Paperless Trade series. And I'm really pleased today to be joined by Bill Cole, who's an international trade specialist. And he's recently started Cole Trade International after 5 years as a partner at BDO and 12 years earlier than that with PwC and an earlier career that involved customs and international trade management at Holden, GMH Limited in Australia. And he also spent a long time before 2000 within the Australian Customs Service. And over the time, he has developed expertise in practice areas around international trade compliance, customs duty and excise, customs administration, industry policy and assistance, trade measures, and supply chain and strategy. He represents industry on a number of committees and has done over a long period of time. And he's also published a number of papers. But today we're really wanting to talk with him around Australia's regulatory environment. And Bill has been undertaking research towards a PhD around the Customs Act 1901 and its potential reforms. So I'd be really keen to hear this conversation, Bill, and over to you if you'd like to present your thoughts, and then we'll have our usual question and answer session. To any in the audience, please use the Q&A button to ask your questions, and we will try and get to those in that discussion session. But over to you, Bill, for your presentation, and I'll share the screen and slides, and you tell me when to turn the pages.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your generous introduction, and welcome to participants. It's clearly been an instructive and wide-ranging series, so I thank ACITI for putting these together. I think they've brought together the kinds of expertise that we need to hear from on a regular basis around the industry, which sadly I think is lacking in a strong voice. So I thank you for your efforts.
Terrific. Can you see the slide share?
Here we are. Yes, very good. So I'll comment a little bit on the title page because of course everything has a story. The part of the genesis of my inquiry into the Customs Act was many years ago as a young customs officer, discovering a piece of valuation advice. I was in the valuation section. For those of you who are unaware of it, the Customs Act spends 70 pages describing how you value goods for customs purposes. And yes, sometimes the invoice is not enough. But in looking into a particular matter, I came across a piece of advice from a young Gough Whitlam from 1944, and that caused me to have a look further into the provenance of the Customs Act and the commentators of it. I went back to 1927 and Wollaston, who was the first collector of customs, and back to 1903 when the first High Court discussion around the scope of the Customs Act versus the state's controls. And I realised, everybody, that for 120 odd years, we've had a piece of legislation that has not been substantially amended. So what was put forward to the or created by the Parliament in its first sessions in 1901 remains mostly intact. I was able to identify most of the sections in the modern Act that came from that time, and I pondered on the fact that we have this unchanged continuity of concept across a couple of centuries, but we have an immensely dynamic trading environment. We have incredible commercial and technological shifts that businesses and governments have needed to align themselves with, but we still had a core of legislation that remained the same. So it occurred to me, and particularly in the context of, I suppose, probably over a decade and a half now of discussions around efficiency, productivity, growth, and the Australian economy, as to what role the Customs Act may have played in this. Because fundamentally, the Customs Act, along with everything else that it is a piece of economic legislation. And I asked myself, there aren't many pieces of economic legislation that can last that long and still be doing what was intended and still acting effectively and efficiently in the economy. So that's what, in general terms, that's what brought my head to this point. And you'll note that I'm going to be talking really about notes, because of course my thesis hasn't been completed. My doctoral status hasn't been conferred, so it's still work in progress. But I think I've decided for today that I'll take my abstract and my hypothesis statement, and we might examine the idea of the Customs Act 1901 from the questions that I've asked in those areas. Slide, please. So some of the core ideas and questions. And the key piece, just to reiterate, if we're talking about economic regulation in an economy, we've got to understand what it does and how relevant it is to, if you like, the context. How does it operate? Where does it come from? Things like that. And why should we look at it at all? Obviously, whatever I may say or anyone else may say about the Customs Act, its age and its relevance, the fact is it remains a central piece of, if you like, our external economy, in the sense that it governs a lot of the behaviours around our exports. It certainly deals with the inputs to our internal economy in terms of goods and commodities that cross the border. So obviously it works, in the sense that in the binary sense of success or failure, it obviously works. It still remains an active item in our economy. So really what we need to do, I thought, was to have a look at narrowing down the elements of the Customs Act and working out what the impacts were, whether they were relevant or optimal, and starting from those kinds of perspectives. So, to quote, the thesis examines the role and impact of the Customs Act 1901 as an example of economic legislation affecting contemporary Australian international trade supply chains. So whatever it did in 1901, it's still impacting in 2023. Australia has regularly received a low ranking from the World Bank in terms of the ease with which international trade can be conducted across Australian borders. This ranking is inconsistent with commodity promotion and trade agreements pursued by the Australian government to enhance Australian trade outcomes. So the second layer in this really is, okay, if the Customs Act is a major piece of legislation at the border governing imports and exports, and we are ranked 95th by the World Bank in terms of ease of performing international trade, then is there a link between the condition of the Customs Act and this ranking? For the third point, in considering the scope of trade review and reform in the public domain, and I started off by looking at Matthias Cormann Forward and others. No mention is made of the adequacy or otherwise of government border-related laws and requirements in furthering the task of achieving positive trade outcomes. So trade is very important to Australia, and everybody talks about growing it, and many agreements are put in place by government in order to facilitate trade across various sectors, but never in the policy dialogue is there a discussion about, if you like, the regulatory and administrative side from a government perspective being the subject of review and reform. We have, of course, the example of the Simplified Trade Task Force, which is a beginning of that concept. But in terms of the major policy, we haven't really seen that kind of focus. Given the movement and administration of internationally traded goods involves both commercial and private commercial supply chain arrangements and government laws and admin, it is reasonable to assume that there are impacts that are caused by both business and regulatory influences. Furthermore, Australia has no unified body of law dealing with international trade as such. Instead, the physical, financial, and information flows in Australian international supply chains are regulated by multiple acts of parliament, each dealing with particular aspects of trade. However, the Customs Act represents the oldest and most wide-ranging act enforcing in the commercial environment of trade and influencing international supply chains. Then it can be a focus point for assessing the impact of particular groupings of trade legislation in its interaction with private commercial trade outcomes. So what all that's about is that we have, firstly, no unitary approach to trade regulation. It is split between departments and jurisdictions. Secondly, the influences in international trade are not solely regulatory ones. There are a plethora of influences. We've seen them during COVID. There's no trade if there's no supply chain. So if the ships stop, trade stops. Businesses will decide to enter or not enter Australia. Australian businesses will decide to export or not export. So this paragraph, if you like, is really trying to bring across that whatever the answer is to the question of the adequacy of a particular act, the Customs Act in particular, and however strong it is in relevance to the border, there are other things that will ultimately have an influence as well. And finally, the thesis is concerned with examining the premise that the Customs Act 1901 imposes unnecessary costs and restrictions on Australian international supply chains, and whether or not it should be rewritten to accommodate 21st century commercial needs. So that last piece, I suppose, is meant to be a distillation of a number of the other ideas. One of the measures of success or failure in economic legislation is really around outcomes. So does having the Customs Act unnecessarily impose costs and restrictions? Sorry. In having the Customs Act 1901 as it is, does that impose unnecessary costs and restrictions on Australian supply chains? Therefore, does it need to be reformed to remove those costs and restrictions? Slide, thank you. So it's a big question. And the context is international trade in the Australian context. So we'll forget about Australia for a moment and look at what global trade means. 50% of global GDP is accounted for by imports and exports of goods and services. In Australia, that amount is 46% of GDP. It is a very, very significant activity. And whether the burden of efficiency and currency lies solely or mostly with the Customs Act 1901 or not, the fact is the issue is an important one and would reasonably require due diligence and attention under any other circumstance. I won't go through too many of the other stats. You can see them for yourself. But the fact is that as a small open economy with nearly half of our GDP dependent on international trade in goods and services, we really need to pay attention. Next slide, please. So moving from my abstract, I got to the hypothesis and the hypothesis statement. As you would expect, is there a case for amending the provisions of the Customs Act 1901 as they relate to commercial matters in order to improve the cost and efficiency of Australian international trade? Please note, as they relate to commercial matters, and I'll explain that in a moment. The significance of this research relates to its assessment of the suitability of legislation that directly affects economic impacts in international trade. If the Customs Act 1901 is not consistent with the trade policy espoused by the Australian government and cannot support initiatives intended to facilitate trade, then rewriting all or part of the legislation should be considered. So if it's not fit for purpose in the 21st century, with the imperatives of growth, paths for SMEs to scale, the trade and security of strategic substances and minerals, then it needs to be reviewed. In such a scenario, international models of best practice in trade-related modernised legislation should be identified for adoption by legislators. And we have, we'll touch on a few of what those look like further in the presentation. Next slide, please. So we need to rewind then. A lot's been said about this piece of legislation, the Customs Act 1901, and we need to understand what it does, how it does it, and where it sits. So in summary, the Act is empowered under the Australian Constitution. It's a federal law which regulates international trade. It implements controls on imports, exports of certain goods and services. The Customs Act covers issues such as duties, which is a revenue, records and information, and law enforcement. So pausing just there, revenue, administration, law enforcement, it's already beginning to get a little bit complicated. It received royal assent on 3rd of October 1901, and entered into force as Act number 6 of 1901 on the 4th of October 1901. So it's older than any of us. Next slide, please. I asked you to take note of the fact that it was a Revenue Act, an Administration Act, a Law Enforcement Act. For ease of understanding, I've created this table and colour-coded parts of the Act that can be easily characterised in particular ways, such as commercial. What do I mean by commercial? Commercial regulation deals with matters around the movement of goods, the requirements on goods, etc., etc., etc. Law enforcement, penalties, requirements, the holding or withholding of permissions, etc., etc. Administration in the light blue refers to the need to report, to discharge, to do things in accordance with the Act that provide information and or verification to a customs authorised person. And finally, specifics, goods and services. We've got various provisions in the Customs Act which act as catch-alls for movements of goods, ships, dates and times by which things must be done, etc., etc. So I'm pointing this out to you because an assessment of the Act as a piece of economic legislation is a little bit cheeky in the sense that it does a lot more than that. And arguably, depending on what empirically can be demonstrated, one argument around the need to recast the Customs Act may stem from the fact that we have at least 4 categories of action within the law, within the Customs Act, some of which may not be consistent, some of which may require the loading up of administrative burden to satisfy multiple purposes, some of which may in fact create conflicts between the facilitation of trade and the enforcement of laws and standards. And certainly in the past, there have been discussions around whether or not commercial elements of the Act reasonably should sit in other departments or with other acts, and that, for instance, law enforcement aspects of the Act should be put in separate acts, etc., etc. So there are certainly arguments that have been aired about disaggregation of the Act to support a simplified, clearer set of requirements for both business and regulators. Slide, please. So further into my hypothesis statement, I delved down into a series of impact questions, key issues that I felt needed to be answered in order to start concluding on the bigger matters that we've spoken about. The first cab off the rank was impact. And I wrote, along with other factors including commercial arrangements between businesses, the general trading environment and the requirements of foreign governments, Australian legislation controlling the movement and reporting of international trade in goods across Australia's borders is an influence on the efficiency and cost of international supply chains. So that's it up front. Does legislation influence efficiency and cost? I think we've certainly by proxy, there have been projects. Bryan and myself certainly had elements of engagement with a project with the Port of Brisbane around what the efficiencies in communication brought, and the if you like, streamlined reporting brought in a port environment to cost. There was clearly cost reductions. There were clearly efficiency increases, and I think it's true to say from that and some other studies that have been undertaken that the easier it is, the quicker it is, the fewer times that you have to do the same thing in different places, there is a positive cost and efficiency outcome. Now, the base argument for this, of course, is no legislation would result in cheaper, quicker supply chains. Absolutely correct, but that is not a proposition that's being contemplated in this approach. The fact is that regulation is required at the border. It ensures the safety of the community. It interdicts harmful substances. It collects revenue, etc., etc. I think the discussion really revolves around the how. And in terms of impact, and from studies, particularly from University of Bath in the UK and various other places, supply chain costs are influenced by regulation. They're influenced by other things, as I've already said, but there is a economic and network impact. Slide, please. Further Further to the question of what, if anything, is causing trouble or reducing the competitiveness of Australian goods and supply chains, is the idea of relevance. So is the Customs Act 1901 a key body of legislation that regulates international supply chains in and out of Australia? I think in terms of Australia, the Australian experience and those of other places where the impact is magnified, I think relevance is absolutely proved. I think it is the case that the Customs Act 1901 has a significant relevance to the operation of international supply chains. In fact, I'd suggest that over time it has gone past the point of relevance and in fact has shaped the nature of Australian supply chains, and that is a difficult set of circumstances to unpick. But the fact is that businesses react to and adapt to regulation at the border. Similarly, of course, with simplified and efficient approaches to administration and regulation at the border, we would reasonably anticipate that businesses would adapt to that also and recognise the values and efficiencies of positive change. Next slide, please. Consensus. This has increasingly become a very significant issue in my research, because we have examples in major trading partners where the role of regulation, if you like, in improving trade outcomes has been recognised and is currently being used in a number of jurisdictions to improve trade between nations. There has been recognition in both public and private sectors of the need to improve international trade outcomes in Australia. This recognition has resulted in the acceleration of trade agreement negotiations, the consideration of options to automate various administrative requirements, and the development of limited access compliance-based trade facilitation programs. And yet, you know, we sit here, I suppose, after considerable discussion and a lot of money over the past few years, and we haven't really got to the point where we're looking at our own regulation. And I'm in part heartened by that, because of course it gives me plenty of leeway to go down a number of paths. But it is a gap in Australian policy. If I compare with the EU, if I compare with the US, significant first world trading partners with Australia of significance, and we need to review and examine what our trading partners are doing in a global trading network. It's reasonably clear to me that that's an imperative. Next slide, please. I touched on this just before, convergence. You've probably not noticed it, but the World Trade Organization itself has, I'll stick my neck out and say that it's a fading organization, and what we're faced with now increasingly are a range of increasingly regional approaches to international trade and economics. The importance of that statement is that at the end of the day, there will be networks that are recognised, and there will be networks that will not be as easily accorded recognition. We need to be looking at what the trading regimes around us are doing, and try and align how we approach data, how we approach risk, how we approach security, how we approach facilitation, and who we trust. And those issues manifest themselves in key regulation at the border. They're not things that happen after it. If you look at the EU protocols, the UCC, recent UCC reforms, the Customs and Border Protection changes to legislation coming in the US, they all focus on the same things, and they all require enhanced access to information, enhanced understanding of the contents of shipping containers, all with a view to having time to pre-clear goods, time to identify areas of risk so that trade can be stopped for legitimate purposes, and safety and other regulatory standards ensured. Convergence is a part of our world, and key regulation at the border is how it manifests itself. Slide, please. So I've called this push-pull. These are issues that come into or have been intruding into my research from time to time. They don't go to the central question per se. The first point about economic law reform and the Customs Act, excuse me, we have law reform protocols. We have the Law Reform Commission. We have ways and means of looking at laws over time. Admittedly, these principles and processes haven't been applied regularly to economic law, but it seems to me that we have mechanisms at our disposal to examine the Customs Act. We certainly have the Productivity Commission at our fingertips, who can apply excellent quantitative methods to provide the basis or discount the need for reviews of the Customs Act. I think the question itself, I suppose, has become muddied by the fact that the Customs Act is not purely an economic act; it's a law enforcement act, etc., etc. So it represents a more complex activity. However, the fact is that we at least have the outlines of approaches to review this from a policy standpoint. The second point around bureaucratic capture, and to a lesser extent, epistemic communities, these horizontal lines of communication that examine proposals or ideas from an internal perspective and not an external perspective. So there are bureaucratic and policy imperatives and processes that may or may not encourage the active review of the Customs Act 1901. And the reason for that is that we have a large body of people who are specifically employed to apply the law as it is. And the idea of the law not as it is a difficult idea. So I'll leave the idea of bureaucratic capture to a couple of observations. Firstly, what the purpose of the Customs Act is twofold. Obviously, it does at the end of the day seek to have goods come through the border for economic purposes. It also has the purpose of controlling those goods and scrutinising those goods for government purposes. And finding the balance between those two sometimes opposing viewpoints really requires a range of examinations of topics such as risk, administrative processes, economic cost, and a whole range of other attributes, some of which we've already spoken about in the macro, but at the level of the shipment, some of these features come to bear. Finally, I'll talk to sectoral interests. I think, as I said earlier, business reacts to regulation by adapting to it and making adaptations to it. There are shipping lines that have spent a lot of money adapting to the Customs Act and procedures as it is at the moment. Similarly, freight forwarders, similarly others. A change in the Customs Act is obviously a change for businesses. Some will view that positively, others will not. Some have their position in the supply chains insured by the Customs Act, and certain changes to the Customs Act would mean that potentially supply chain lengths are shortened. The participants in supply chain would be reduced, and as a case, that is a negative factor for some supply chain participants. Finally, risk. I think it's true to say with any act that has law enforcement attributes to it, that the idea of recasting risk in the face of potential redrafting of the Customs Act and or the interventions and information gleaned under those controls will be contentious. In my experience with the Customs Act, there is little willingness to really discuss risk continuums, risk modelling, the use of private data versus public data. It is a can of worms, and I think risk, if we scrape away a lot of the layers above it, represents a significant aspect of reluctance to review the Customs Act. I might leave it there, Brian, because I've probably taken it a little further than our intended timing. So thank you for your attention, and Brian, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Bill. Really, really interesting. I guess so we all have a sense this is, as you pointed out at the start, research which is underway. When can we expect a finalisation of this? I'm certain your university asked you that question too.
Well, I've got a deadline in 3 years, so it'll be before then.
Okay, so good to have some context. So, Bill, you touched there on a whole range of themes, so I'll ask you some questions. If there are audience members who have questions, please use the Q&A functions around that. But Bill, just to start, you've touched on effectiveness as a topic there, I guess, or impact. And good legislation and good policy should be both effective and efficient. So the law has been long-standing since 1901, and if we think about that, that also predates the taxation powers of the Commonwealth. For example, it predates the GATT agreements internationally. It predates the WTO, and it might predate the World Customs Organization and their rules as well. I guess some would argue that sounds like it's pretty effective, and efficient. It's been doing this job of law enforcement and revenue collection for a long time, and it does that. But how do you measure effectiveness, or how will you approach measuring the impact and the effectiveness of the current law against what we might have as alternates?
I'll just quickly make the point about some of you will recall the Productivity Commission study during COVID on the failure or otherwise of critical supply chains during COVID? The answer was routinely no, they did not fail. And the measure there was, did anything stop? And the answer was no, nothing stopped, but a delivery schedule that was usually 2 weeks took 9 months. It didn't stop, but was meaningless for the purposes of the end user. So the supply chain, the border clearance, the collection of revenue can continue endlessly, but without the focus, if you like, the holistic focus of the intended use, if you like, of the Act. So I think if we take the view as back in those days that if the Customs Act is purely a revenue raising act, then you do whatever the Act says and you pay your money. In the 21st century, we say, well, tax office or state revenue office or whoever we're dealing with, yes, I have to pay my tax, but I don't want to spend 6 months doing it. I need to do it in conjunction with other, what are now commercial norms in our society. The things that allow our economy to run properly are not just fulfillment, it's fulfillment within particular times. And time is expensive. We all know, or most of us will know, that the consequence of having goods on a wharf for more than 48 hours is a significant cost. The cost of having goods sit in a depot for more than a particular amount of time is a significant cost. Now, a lot of these costs are not necessarily due to government regulation, but the operation, if you like, the working of the Act in conjunction with the system is, I think, probably the measure that I'm curious about. So there'll be norms in a system. The system has been built around the regulation, but if the regulation then sits above it and says, well, I'll take my own good time, the system can churn and then stop, and then I'll have a release in, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 days time, then that's a disconnect, and that requires a refinement. Now, whether that refinement is an administrative one or a regulatory one, that's a moot point. How I will look at it is 2 ways. It'll be in comparison with major trading partners, and that'll be that'll probably realistically come down to basically the US and the EU for obvious reasons, and also in terms of the cycles of the commercial cycles that move around it. So if a ship can unload in 24 hours and a truck be ready in another 24 hours, you would need everything to align. I think that would be a best case scenario for the economic outcome. Now, what has to move along at the same time with that is satisfaction of whatever the risk regime is, the transfer of information, the layer cake that represents the border.
Thanks, Bill. So you also touched on Australia's ranking. You mentioned 95th, so I think that's an earlier ranking than the most recent one, which was 106th. Although it hasn't still been done in a couple of years' time, so maybe different again. But when you compare that with the other aspirations, the government has a digital strategy, DFAT has a digital trade strategy, both of which include statements around Australia being a top 10 nation in a digital sense. So how are you reconciling, or how might you look at those types of aspirations for our whole of economy, as opposed to where the Customs Act is and related acts? And then, as we've noted, the United States, I think just overnight even, has announced it will be reforming its own Customs Act again after 30 years in ways that reflect the modern economy of the embracement of e-commerce, presumably the coming notions around 3D printing capability and the exchange of IP, etc. Where does our 1901 Act, as amended, let's give it some credit that it has been amended,
150 times.
150 amendments, great, is, how is it fit for purpose, and how will we make sure we keep up with our trading partners?
I'll first make the observation that the US announcements at their core are entirely consistent with the UCC reforms. So just to make that convergence and consensus comment again, the fact is that both those blocks, and I'll call them blocks, are saying the same thing about data, facilitation, interdiction, and everything else. So they're coming together. The earlier point about really not having a top-down approach to trade, which I made in the early parts of this discussion, is important here. So both the EU and the US are talking about systems. So they're talking about reforms to a trade system. My inquiry, of course, is really about one element of that, albeit a major piece. So I just want to make that clear that what I'm about to say is really off-piste in terms of the actual thesis, but inevitable observation that the fact is that we don't take a systems-based approach to international trade, and to rank us in the top 10 digitally is an act of fantasy. In my view, we are very far behind in so many ways. The fact is that the integration of digital and other sophisticated features into a trade environment is patchwork. It's driven by industry and occasional government initiated changes. We need to look at the whole box and dice. The flip side is, for instance, I tallied up the number of sections between the Biosecurity Act and the Customs Act that require reporting. I came up with 100 and then I stopped. The fact is that we've got a lot of, if you like, straight administrative actions that a proper digital strategy at the border could assist with, let alone a fully integrated single window approach to trade management. Now, the Customs Act, of course, can be the major empowering legislation for that. It's certainly been used for good, in my view, in terms of the providing another aspect that's coming out of the EU and the US, which is trusted groups, authorised economic operators in the EU's parlance. In ours, it's Australian Trusted Traders. So we know that it can do certain things, but until we start thinking more broadly about what does it mean to be the pivotal point of regulation at the border, with enormous numbers of delegations, probably up to 50 pieces of legislation if you wanted to stretch it, it could be something different. It could be something very different. It could be the fountainhead of an efficient trading system.
So 150 amendments, and we've also sort of commented that it's a bit resistant to change. You've got the bureaucratic capture comment that people, and particularly inside government, don't like to change that much. It's my observation, so I'll just test this with you, is that principally the Customs Act gets amended when a court case has gone against the interest of the administrator, or we've had a free trade agreement or some other international agreement which has caused some changes, but possibly principally only around the tariff schedules. around that. How are you seeing the attitude towards change around trade facilitation? We've also got commitments in our trade agreements and with the World Customs Organization and the World Trade Organization to facilitate trade. So where is that function of trade facilitation sitting inside our legal framework, which is aimed at revenue and law enforcement?
I think we do a reasonable job in writing things down. What manifests itself in actual administration, I'm not convinced is transmits that goodwill into action. I think, I mean, to be entirely frank, if I looked at the trends in where the resourcing and not necessarily financial, but possibly human capital have gone over the past decade and a bit, it would definitely be into the law enforcement side of things. I think the commercial side has languished. I agree with you that the amendments to the Customs Act 1901 have been accumulative in their approach. So it's always an and. But they're not new ideas. They're the same idea repeated time after time after time. So we have increasing bodies of things that are different in small ways, small enough to get you a penalty or to have your goods stopped, but not significant in terms of turning around some practices to accommodate new requirements more easily. So we have, at the same time, a new, a fistful of new free trade agreements, but nothing that makes the administration easier for them in the body of the Customs Act itself. Each one of these agreements, I'd argue, is in fact, if we're going to the trouble of doing all that work around the tariff schedules and 156 and 157 of the Customs Act around origin and the like, surely it's an opportunity to look at what we can take out. What can we make easier? So we have these ongoing amendment cycles that are single purpose, whereas they represent opportunities to change things incrementally.
So, Bill, who has a model law or framework that would be useful in contemplating a new regime should one be contemplated? And I keep in mind, of course, that the Australian Law Reform Commission did in fact attempt and drafted a modernised Customs Act some time ago, but that really didn't see the light of day too much, and there's never been another attempt that I'm aware of. But the discussion around single windows and in fact obligations, we've agreed to do such things. Who's got a good set of regulations that we might look at, or is it part of the model law systems which intergovernmental bodies have started to develop?
As you saw at the start, I've taken a normative approach as my method. So the model law approach is what I'm favouring. I think what I've observed, quite frankly, the one good thing about the New Zealand recasting of their Customs Act was the method that they employed. I thought that they really missed all kinds of opportunities in potentially simplifying their legislation. They didn't do it, but their method was excellent. How they moved it through government, how they took industry input was very, very good. The other bit I'd plug into that would be the EU's approach of a number of panels of experts looking at what needed to be changed, what needed to be removed, what would balance between risk and advantage in terms of new regulation under the UCC. So I think the answer, Brian, is probably not off the shelf. I think it's every nation has its reasons for what it's doing. I mean, you've got to scratch your head about trade measures, anti-dumping, things like that. Why the hell is that there? But the fact is we have got it, and it needs to be accommodated. How you do it is the interesting bit for me. And if we're on solid ground and we're not compromising our international obligations and we're not compromising the competitiveness of Australian businesses, then who cares? But it needs to be interrogative. It needs to be drawing on whatever best practice that we can find in terms of method, and it needs to look long and hard about purpose.
So, Bill, you also mentioned the impact that the Act itself has on the architecture, the commercial architecture of business, and also support services like freight forwarders, et cetera, and presumably now increasingly information technology type companies that are, even so the Act is this way, there are technology applications which are making things easier for business even without the reforms. How much does business have, if you like, an embedded system that needs time to depreciate before they can then commence a new system themselves? But also noting that it is international trade, and so while there's an Australian system, there's a counterparty system, and businesses are already dealing with both of those, or maybe many multiples in between, depending on the supply chain. So how difficult do you think change would be for business, given that it would take, a number of years to actually undertake a reform process in any case? But
I'd make two
how do you mix those things together?
Yeah. So we're already seeing change. We're already seeing, if you like, the set piece behaviours of maybe the past 20 years are beginning to shake up. They're doing it for reasons other than the Customs Act. They're doing it because of the usual roller coasters of global transportation and merger and acquisition and failure that normally occurs. So in a number of instances, I've been able to observe behaviours where certain parts of the supply chain are cut out. So that's interesting in the first instance. So we have some kind of emerging trend in some areas of, if you like, the supply chain that reports under the Customs Act, either under threat or being removed entirely. The other piece, I suppose, if we look at your question in terms of maybe a technological approach, because quite frankly, the other viewpoint is that there are players in the supply chains that probably won't be here in 10 years, regardless. If we look at maybe a technological approach and how would that look in terms of adapting to a changed Customs Act, I think it's probably a quicker and cleaner process that would have been in the past. I think adopters of most of the trade management systems at the moment would easily adapt to the kinds of alterations that would be logical first steps, and those would be information-based ones, in my view. If we look at the 5 or 6 times the same piece of information is reported under the Customs Act for the same shipment, then you would ask yourself, well, tighten up your information and your verification and certification of information and your sources, and you can take that down to 2 or 3 times. We've already carved out $50 to $100 out of a movement of goods. So I would suggest to you that most most of the scale in international trade into Australia is dominated by those kinds of systems, and I think that they would adapt quickly. It's really about the loss of businesses at the end of the day.
Sure, and an important point. We're coming up against time, but I did just want to see if you might clarify, if you have a view. When you think of a Fit for Purpose Act, are you contemplating amending again, so on top of the 150 amendments of the existing Act, or are you favouring you would actually write a new Act and allow this one to be superseded by something else?
I've struggled with this question for probably 5 years now, and I think realistically, the safe approach would be to amend certain parts of the existing Act, and basically as a proof of concept approach. But I think the truth is, I think we need a new Act, root and branch.
Well, there's a good spot to end. Thank you very much, Bill. I'm sure the conversation may well have raised a whole lot of other questions, but we don't have time to deal with those.
4 days, Bryan, 4 days, I think I've calculated to talk to the full topic.
I don't have a 4-day time slot for my webinars, but we may well return to this. But look, thank you very much, Bill. As I noted, this is our last webinar for 2023. And it's covered 12 important topics, and hopefully been very interesting to the audience. We'll see what happens, but I would like to wish everybody a Merry Christmas, and particularly you, Bill, and Prue and my team as well. But thank you very much for your time today, and we'll sign up for 2023.